The world outside was a cruel, endless stretch of snow. It wasn't the soft kind that reminded you of winters long ago, filled with the laughter of children, the joy of sledding, or the warmth of family gatherings around a fire. No, this snow was a weight, oppressive, cold, and biting. It seemed to have swallowed everything whole, leaving only the harsh outlines of what once was a lively Eastern European village. The wooden houses, once painted in cheerful shades of blue and yellow, had now faded to dull, weathered brown. The streets, once bustling with villagers coming and going, were empty, save for the occasional lone figure trudging through the snow, head down, shoulders hunched against the freezing wind. It was as if life itself had been frozen, trapped in the cold, and now only the ghosts of the past remained. Inside one of those houses, tucked in the corner of the village, a family sat quietly, waiting. The home, though humble, still carried the warmth of those who had lived there for generations. The walls, though worn and cracked, whispered the stories of a past long gone, a time when the patriarch of the family, now an older man, had been a soldier, strong and proud, defending his country. The once proud man now sat hunched by the fire, his hands calloused from years of hard labor, his face weathered and lined by a lifetime of struggles. His wife, a woman of quiet strength, moved silently around the room, ensuring the fire burned steadily, despite the dwindling supply of wood. Her hands were worn too, but they moved with a practiced grace, as if in defiance of the war that had taken so much from them. Their children, two young ones, sat near the fire, their faces etched with the confusion and fear that had become their constant companions. The youngest, a boy of no more than 10, stared into the flames, his eyes flickering with the fire's dance. He didn't fully understand what was happening. He only knew that the world had shifted, that it had tilted on its axis, and the familiar warmth of family, community, and routine had been replaced with a shadow of uncertainty. He knew, somehow, that his father, once a figure of strength and authority, now seemed smaller. The boy looked at his father's face, and for the first time, saw the deep lines of worry etched there. His father was no longer the man who could protect them from anything. That thought, though unspoken, clung to the room like the cold itself. The boy didn't dare ask his father about it. He could sense the silent weight of the war on his family, and it was something too heavy for words. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the thin wooden walls. It was a noise that had become all too familiar, a constant companion to the grim uncertainty that had gripped their lives. The patriarch's eyes wandered to the window, his gaze distant. He had once fought for this land, for this home. But now, it felt as though everything was slipping away from him. The war that had started so far from their doorstep had slowly inched its way closer, until it had consumed everything. His thoughts were consumed by fear, the fear that the next knock on the door would be the one that would change everything, that would take his family from him, or worse, send them into the unknown, where they would never be seen again. He thought of the occupying soldiers, the ones who had swept through the village like a flood. They were everywhere now, soldiers of a foreign army, patrolling the streets, taking what they wanted, and leaving the village in a state of shattered dignity. The patriarch had seen them in passing, their cold eyes and stiff posture betraying little emotion. But there was one thing the patriarch knew for certain: the soldiers were not here to help. They were here to impose their will, to take what they wanted, and to leave destruction in their wake. He had seen it happen to others, people who once lived just down the road, families who were now gone, replaced by empty houses, their windows shattered, their doors kicked in. As the wind howled outside, the father could not escape the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The soldiers would come for them, just as they had come for others. He had seen enough to know that no one was safe, not even those who once thought they were. His thoughts turned to the family, to his wife and children. How long could they survive like this? How long before the inevitable came knocking at their door? His heart ached at the thought of his children, their faces so innocent, so unknowing of the horrors that had come to define their world. His wife, ever the pillar of the family, seemed to sense his thoughts. She didn't ask, didn't need to. She simply placed a warm hand on his shoulder, her silent comfort a balm to his tortured mind. The room was silent except for the crackling fire, which struggled to stay alive. The patriarch's eyes shifted to the door. He knew it was coming. The soldiers would come for them, and there was no escaping it. He had no choice but to wait, to endure the quiet torture of anticipation. There would be no fighting back. He had long since laid down his arms, realizing that resistance, for all its bravado, would be futile. The world had changed, and the rules of survival had shifted along with it. The night was long, but in the darkness, the family clung to the hope that somehow they would survive, that somehow they would make it through this. The wind outside seemed to intensify, a constant reminder of the chaos just beyond the door. Yet inside, the family remained locked in their fragile world of warmth and silence. The flickering flames cast long shadows across the room, elongating the figures of the family members, their faces drawn, their expressions a mix of fear, uncertainty, and something else, a quiet, unspoken defiance. They had been pushed to the edge, but they were not broken. They had not yet given in to the darkness that seemed to creep closer every day. In this small room, at least, they still had each other. Time stretched on. The hours bled together, each minute another beat in the slow, relentless march of waiting. The door would come, and they would face whatever came next, whether it was the soldiers or worse. The patriarch took one last look at his children, his wife, and the fire that had warmed their hearts. His grip on the chair tightened, his mind racing with 1,000 scenarios, each one more harrowing than the last. The silence was almost unbearable now. He longed for the noise of the world outside, anything to break the stillness, to give him something to hold on to. But the silence remained unbroken. And then there it was. The sound of boots in the snow. The unmistakable crunch, the sharpness of the step. At first, it was distant, just a faint echo of what might be coming. But then it grew louder, closer. The patriarch's heart quickened, the beat now erratic, as though his chest were a drum, pounding with the rhythm of impending doom. His wife's hand tightened on his arm, and his children stiffened, their eyes wide. They had heard it too. The knock would come soon. And yet, as the snow crunched louder, it was not the sound they expected. Not the familiar, ominous tread of the soldiers, but something else. Something strange, something unfamiliar. The door was about to open. The family held their breath. The patriarch's heart stopped. This was the moment. The waiting was over. Would they face the wrath of soldiers, or something else entirely? As the door began to creak open, the answers would soon reveal themselves. The silence that had clung to the house for hours was finally broken by the sound of boots crunching in the snow outside. It was a sound that seemed to pierce through the stillness, an audible reminder of the danger that loomed just beyond the fragile warmth of the family's hearth. The patriarch's heart quickened as he rose slowly from his seat by the fire, his eyes narrowing toward the door, listening intently. His fingers clenched the edge of the table, and his breath, shallow and uneven, seemed to blend with the crackling of the fire. He knew this sound all too well, the deliberate, purposeful steps of soldiers who had long since made themselves familiar with the lay of the land. They were coming for him, for his family, and the cold terror that surged through his veins was something he could not shake. The family had heard that sound before. There was no mistaking it. It was the sound of soldiers. The sound of an occupying force, relentless and unyielding. It was the sound of power and control, a sound that came without warning, a sound that stripped people of their dignity and their safety. The family had learned to recognize it over the past year as their world had shrunk, the radius of their survival narrowing with each passing day. The snow outside, once so comforting in its purity, had become a graveyard, its coldness an extension of the harshness that had taken root in their village. And now, those boots were marching closer, inexorably, and they would soon be at the door. The patriarch's wife moved silently behind him, her gaze fixed on the door, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her shawl. She didn't speak, there was no need. They both knew what this moment meant. The children sat quietly by the fire, their wide eyes fixed on the door, sensing the tension in the air. The youngest child, a boy no older than 10, clutched his older sister's hand, his fingers white with fear. His sister, a little older but no less terrified, stared at their father, searching for some sign of reassurance, some flicker of hope. But all she saw was the same look she had seen in his eyes for months now, an overwhelming, suffocating fear. They were all trapped in it, the waiting, the helplessness that came with knowing that the knock on the door could change everything. And then the sound came again, closer now, so close that it almost seemed to echo in the room. The patriarch stiffened, his body tense, his hands suddenly cold. He wanted to shout, to demand that they go away, to protect his family, to take action, but his voice was stolen by fear. The door was all that stood between them and whatever fate awaited them. The fire behind them flickered faintly, its light casting long, trembling shadows on the walls, but it seemed so small in comparison to the enormity of the moment. The family was caught in a fragile bubble of life, and outside that bubble, the world was raw and brutal. There was a sudden knock, a single, sharp rap on the door. It was a sound that seemed to carry through the air like an accusation. The patriarch hesitated, his breath caught in his throat. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes meeting his wife's, and for the first time in months, they exchanged a glance that held more than just the weight of fear. It was something deeper, something unspoken. There was a sadness there, yes, but also a strange sort of recognition, an acknowledgement that whatever happened next would not be in their hands. It would be the soldiers who decided their fate, not them. The patriarch took a long, shuddering breath, and then he walked slowly toward the door, each step heavy with the knowledge that he was about to open it to a world he no longer understood. His hand gripped the door's cold handle, and for a moment he simply stood there, the weight of history pressing down on him. He had fought for this land, once. He had stood on battlefields where death was the only certainty, but even there had been a sense of control. He had known what to expect, what was at stake. But now, the war had become something unrecognizable, a fight where the enemy was not always clear, where survival meant something far more fragile than it ever had before. As he slowly turned the handle, the door creaked open with a sound that seemed almost too loud in the quiet of the house. What he saw outside was not what he had expected. The snow, swirling and biting in the harsh wind, framed the figures that stood before him. He could make out the silhouettes of men, their breath rising in clouds of vapor against the cold night air. They were dressed in the dark uniforms of foreign soldiers, their faces grim but not unkind. For a fleeting moment, the patriarch thought he might be imagining it. The soldiers didn't look like the faceless monsters he had come to fear, the men who had ravaged other villages and left destruction in their wake. These men, though they bore the same uniforms, carried no immediate threat. They were simply standing there, cold and weary, their boots caked in snow, their eyes not searching for fear or compliance but simply for shelter. The patriarch's heart raced as he stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process the image before him. The soldiers were not the towering figures of menace he had expected. They were tired, their faces lined with the marks of war, their eyes reflecting a quiet exhaustion. The leader, a man who appeared to be in his early 30s, looked at him for a long moment before speaking. But his words were not the harsh commands the patriarch had braced himself for. They were softer, almost apologetic. The leader, in broken words that spoke more of fatigue than of power, asked for refuge, if only for a night, if only to warm themselves by the fire. The patriarch blinked, his breath caught in his throat. He could not quite believe what he was hearing. Refuge? From them? From the men who had invaded their land, whose presence had turned their once peaceful home into a place of constant fear. He wanted to refuse, to slam the door shut, to scream that he had no room for enemies, no room for invaders. But something in the leader's voice stopped him. It was not the voice of an enemy. It was the voice of a man who had seen too much of the same suffering. The leader's eyes were hollow, tired, and his posture slumped in a way that told the patriarch that this man had not come for anything but warmth, not for vengeance or conquest. For a long moment, the patriarch stood there, frozen, as though the very decision was too large for his body to bear. His eyes flickered over the men standing outside, each of them no older than he had been when he first donned a soldier's uniform, no older than the sons he had raised. He could see it now, the weight they all carried, the weight of survival, of being trapped in a war that seemed endless, a war that had turned even enemies into victims. The patriarch's heart seemed to pulse with a strange, unfamiliar emotion. something akin to pity, to shared humanity. He had never thought he would pity a soldier. He had never thought he would see them as men in the same way that he saw his neighbors, his family. The firelight flickered faintly behind him, its warmth a distant memory in the frozen air. The patriarch took a deep breath, his chest heavy with the decision before him. Slowly, almost without thinking, he stepped back and opened the door wider, silently inviting the soldiers inside. For a brief moment, it felt like the world had shifted. The soldiers, though still armed, did not seem like the enemies he had imagined. They were simply men who had been forced into a war that no one wanted, men who, perhaps, shared the same hopes and fears as his own family. The room was small, the fire was flickering, and as the soldiers stepped inside, shedding their frozen coats, there was an awkwardness in the air, but also something more, a quiet, shared recognition. They were all caught in the same nightmare, and there was, in that moment, a glimmer of something unexpected: humanity. The door closed behind them with a soft thud, and the cold outside was shut away, replaced by the warmth of a fire that, for just a moment, felt like more than just heat. It felt like an act of defiance against the war that had torn so many lives apart. The room was still, the crackling fire the only sound that broke the heavy silence. The family watched, unsure of what to make of the unexpected visitors who now stood in their humble home. The soldiers, though relieved to be inside, carried with them an air of weariness, physically spent, emotionally drained. Their faces were grim, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and quiet resignation, the result of an endless journey through a world that had become less about battles and more about survival. They were not the men the family had expected. Their presence was not one of oppression, but of shared fatigue, of mutual understanding, as if the war had robbed them of the very humanity they had once relied on. In that moment, there was no distinction between occupier and occupied. There were only people trying to stay alive. The patriarch stood in the doorway, unsure of how to act, his instincts telling him to be cautious, to watch every move these men made. His mind was still trying to reconcile the man standing before him with the images of soldiers he had grown up with, men who came into villages like this, not to seek shelter but to impose their power, to leave destruction in their wake. But this was different. The soldiers didn't look like the ones he had fought against, or the ones he had feared. They were not cold or menacing. They were cold, yes, but only because of the journey they had undertaken. Their eyes, dark and distant, looked less like those of conquerors and more like those of people who had been pushed to their limits. The air between them hung thick with unspoken questions, each of them unsure of what to do next, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. For the patriarch, the moments that followed felt like a surreal dream. The warmth of the fire, the presence of the soldiers, the silence that wrapped around them, it all seemed so out of place, like a bizarre interlude in the middle of a long, terrible war. His eyes flickered to his wife, who stood beside him, just as frozen as he was, her face unreadable. She had always been the calm in their household, the one who held everything together, but now she was silent, her brow furrowed, her eyes flickering with the same confusion and uncertainty. Their children huddled by the fire, staring at the soldiers as if trying to understand what was happening. The younger boy, who had not yet grasped the full weight of the war, was still clutching his sister's hand. She, older and more perceptive, seemed lost in thought, her mind trying to piece together the puzzle of their new reality. The soldiers slowly began to remove their heavy coats, their movements stiff from cold, their boots leaving wet tracks on the floor. One of them, a man with a scar running down the side of his face, took a seat by the fire. His hands, red and raw from the freezing temperatures, were trembling as he held them out to the warmth. He looked around the room, his eyes meeting those of the family members, but there was no hostility in his gaze. If anything, it was a mixture of gratitude and weariness. The other soldiers followed suit, taking off their heavy coats and boots, each one quietly settling by the fire. There was no tension, no movement that suggested they were here to demand anything. They were simply here to rest, to warm themselves, and to escape the relentless cold that had become a constant companion on their journey. The patriarch remained standing, watching them closely, unsure of how to proceed. He had always been a man of action, someone who could read a situation and respond quickly, but this was different. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't an ambush. This was something far more complicated, something that didn't fit into the framework of war he had known. These soldiers were not his enemies. They were strangers, yes, but they were men just like him, caught in the same storm of violence and suffering that had swept across the land. And for a moment, he wondered if he had been wrong all along to see them only as the enemy. The silence continued, stretched thin by the awkwardness of the situation. The family remained unsure of what to say, unsure of whether they should offer anything. The wife, ever practical, moved silently to the hearth, adding more wood to the fire. The flames danced higher, casting a golden glow across the room, but it seemed too small, too fragile in the face of the uncertainty that had entered their lives. She hesitated for only a moment before turning to the soldiers, her voice soft but firm. "Would you care for something to eat?" she asked, her words breaking the silence in the room like the first drop of rain after a long drought. The soldiers exchanged glances, their expressions softening. The man with the scar, the one who had first spoken, looked at the woman for a long moment before shaking his head gently. "No, thank you," he said, his voice low and raspy from days of travel. "We are grateful for the warmth." He spoke in broken words, his accent thick, but the meaning was clear. He wasn't refusing out of pride or arrogance. He was refusing because, like all of them, he knew the world had changed, and the lines between giving and taking were no longer so easily drawn. They had nothing to give, and they certainly had no right to take. The wife nodded, her face unreadable as she moved back to the fire, her hands busying themselves with the mundane tasks of keeping the warmth alive. She didn't push, didn't argue. There was nothing to be said that could change the reality of their situation. The family was trapped as much by the war as the soldiers themselves. There was no escape. But there was also a strange sense of peace in the way the soldiers had entered their home, quietly, without force, as if they too had been seeking refuge, not conquest. The patriarch finally sat down, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He didn't know what to say to these men, didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. He had spent so many years fighting against the forces that now stood in his home, but now that they were here, he realized how little he truly understood about the nature of war. His mind raced with questions. How had they gotten here? What were they looking for? What had happened to the battles, the power struggles, the fights for control? Where had all of that gone? Was this the new face of war? A face of weariness, of exhaustion, of survival at any cost? The soldiers, too, seemed lost in their own thoughts. They huddled closer to the fire, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were trying to shake off the weight of their journey. The man with the scar reached into his pack and pulled out a small piece of bread. He broke it in half, offering the other half to one of the other soldiers. The gesture was simple, but it felt significant. They were not the enemy. They were not invaders. They were simply men, caught in a war that had gone on far too long, a war that had taken more from them than they could ever repay. The youngest child, who had been watching them with wide eyes, suddenly stood up and moved closer to the soldiers. His small hands trembled as he held out a piece of bread to the man with the scar. The gesture was innocent, pure. He had no understanding of the war, of the divisions that had torn the world apart. All he saw was a man in need, a man who looked as tired and hungry as his own father. The soldier smiled faintly, taking the bread from the boy with a nod of thanks. The exchange was brief, but it felt like a small victory in a world that had forgotten how to offer kindness. For the first time in what felt like years, there was a moment of connection. A moment where the divide between the occupiers and the occupied, between the soldiers and the civilians, seemed to dissipate. It was not the kind of victory that would end a war or bring peace to a land torn apart by conflict. But in that moment, as the fire burned brightly between them, it was enough. It was enough to remind them all that even in the darkest of times, there was still humanity. There was still the possibility for kindness, for understanding. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward something better. The fire continued to crackle softly in the hearth, its warmth the only comfort in the small, dimly lit room. The soldiers, exhausted and worn from their journey, had settled in by the fire, their boots now off, their coats hanging by the door. The family remained at a careful distance, watching them with cautious eyes. The patriarch sat near the fire, his face drawn, his thoughts distant. He could still feel the weight of the decision to let these men inside, but in that moment, it seemed almost inconsequential compared to everything else that had happened, compared to the events that had unfolded around them. The soldiers weren't the enemy in this moment. They were just men, just like him, caught in the same unforgiving web of war. And yet, the discomfort remained. How could he share his home with those who had once been his oppressors? How could he accept them as equals, when everything inside him screamed that they were different, that they were the cause of the suffering that had haunted his family for so long? The silence between them all hung heavy in the room, as thick and suffocating as the winter air outside. The soldiers sat silently, their faces tired and wary, their eyes darting occasionally toward the family, as if unsure of their welcome. No one spoke. It was as if the fire itself had drawn a boundary between them, a barrier that couldn't be crossed. The patriarch, still grappling with the strange turn of events, finally shifted in his seat. His gaze shifted from the soldiers to his wife, who had resumed tending to the fire. She moved with the grace that had always defined her, the woman who had been his anchor in a world full of uncertainty, who had weathered every storm at his side. But even she seemed to be at a loss for how to proceed. She had always known what to do, had always known how to keep their family together, how to survive. But this was new, uncharted territory, and she was as uncertain as he was. The children, too, seemed uncertain. The youngest, the boy, was still sitting near the fire, his eyes fixed on the soldiers. He had stopped asking questions a long time ago, knowing that the answers would only bring more confusion. His older sister, who had always been the more perceptive of the two, sat beside him, her gaze darting back and forth between the soldiers and her parents. She was trying to make sense of everything, trying to understand the strange, uncomfortable reality they found themselves in. She had heard the stories of how the soldiers had come to their village, how they had marched through, leaving a wake of destruction in their path. And yet, here they were, sitting in their home, seeking warmth, not from their weapons, but from the very same fire that the family had struggled to keep alive. The man with the scar, who had first spoken to the family, shifted in his seat. He looked tired, as though the weight of the journey had finally caught up with him. His face was gaunt, the lines etched deep from lack of sleep and constant travel. His eyes were heavy-lidded, his movements slow, as if he were fighting to stay awake. For a moment, it seemed as though he might speak, might offer some explanation, but then the silence swallowed the room again, and he said nothing. The other soldiers sat equally still, their eyes distant, their minds somewhere far beyond the walls of the house. It was clear that they were all haunted by something. Whether it was the horrors of war or the isolation of their journey, no one could say. But in that moment, they were all bound by a shared sense of weariness, a weariness that didn't discriminate between soldier and civilian. War, after all, had a way of breaking everyone, no matter where they stood. The patriarch felt his chest tighten as he studied them. There was no aggression in their eyes, no malice in their posture. They were simply men, tired and broken, just like him, just like his family. He had spent so many years fighting, so many years learning to see the world in terms of enemies and allies, but now, in this moment, that line seemed blurred. It wasn't about sides anymore. It wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about survival, plain and simple. And survival, he realized, was something they all shared, no matter where they came from. He looked again at the fire, at the way the flames danced in the hearth, their flickering light casting shadows on the walls. It was the same fire that had once provided warmth to his family, the same fire that had kept the darkness at bay. Now, it seemed to be doing the same for these men, these strangers who had once been the enemy. The irony was almost too much to bear. They had come here, into his home, seeking something as simple as warmth. But warmth was not something he could give without a price. He had learned that long ago. The wife, still tending to the fire, finally broke the silence. Her voice was soft but steady, as if she had made a decision and was now simply carrying it out. "You must be very tired," she said quietly, her words almost lost in the crackling of the fire. "It has been a long journey, I imagine." The soldiers looked up, their eyes meeting hers for the first time in what felt like hours. There was something in her tone, something that softened the sharp edges of the situation. It was an invitation not just to warmth, but to understanding. It was an acknowledgement of their shared struggle, a small, unspoken bridge across the gap that had separated them. The soldier with the scar nodded slowly, his lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Yes," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It has been a long journey." His words seemed to hang in the air, as if they were not just a simple statement of fact, but a confession, a quiet admission of the toll that the war had taken on them all. The wife nodded, her face softening. She knew the road they had traveled, in one way or another. She had seen her husband leave for battle, had felt the cold emptiness of his absence. She had waited, with the children, wondering if he would ever return. She had seen the toll that war had taken on their lives, the endless nights of fear, the uncertainty of what the next day would bring. And now, here they were, all of them caught in the same storm, no one exempt from its fury. For a moment, there was an almost palpable shift in the room. The soldiers, though still tired and wary, seemed to relax slightly. They no longer seemed like invaders or enemies, but simply men who had seen too much, who had traveled too far, and who were now searching for a moment of peace, however brief it might be. The patriarch, still lost in his thoughts, felt something inside him shift. The lines between them were not as clear as they had once been. They were not the invaders they had once been seen as. They were not the enemy. They were just people, like him, trying to survive, trying to find some semblance of humanity in a world that had stripped so much away. The room seemed to breathe a little easier, as if, for the first time in a long time, the air had cleared. The tension that had been thick in the space between them now seemed to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, unspoken understanding. The soldiers, though still distant, seemed to have lowered their guard, if only a little. The family, though still cautious, felt a strange sense of relief. They were not trapped in this moment of silence anymore. They were not prisoners of the past, of the hatred and fear that had defined their world for so long. They were simply people, sharing a space, sharing a fire. And in that shared moment, there was a strange, fleeting kind of peace. It wasn't the peace of victory or of conquest, or of any of the things the patriarch had once fought for. It was the peace of survival, of endurance, of knowing that, for a brief moment, they were all on the same side of something larger than themselves. The fire crackled, casting its warm glow over them all, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the room was not filled with the cold of war. It was filled with something else, something fragile, something fleeting, but something that, in that moment, felt like hope. As the fire continued to burn in the center of the room, casting flickering shadows against the walls, an almost palpable stillness settled in. The soldiers had begun to unwind, their faces softened by the warmth that seemed to seep into their very bones, and the family, though wary and unsure, had allowed the small moments of peace to fill the space between them. The harsh reality of the world outside, the coldness of the snow, and the looming shadow of war were momentarily suspended, as if held at bay by the fire itself. But despite the temporary respite, a heavy silence remained. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, the kind that carried with it an unspoken understanding of the fragility of what they were experiencing, a shared moment of humanity that could, at any time, be shattered by the brutal forces of war outside the door. The soldiers, though no longer the distant, menacing figures they had once been to the family, were still soldiers. Their eyes, while no longer cold with aggression, were still haunted by the weight of their journey. The scars on their faces, both visible and invisible, told stories of battles fought, of lives lost, of atrocities witnessed that could never be erased. There was no pride in their posture, no bravado in their words. They were simply men who had survived battles, who had been pushed to the edge of their endurance and were now struggling to find some semblance of normalcy in a world that no longer made sense. Their bodies, though physically present in the warmth of the fire, were still partially lost somewhere in the trenches, in the endless march of conflict, in the lives they had left behind. The soldier with the scar on his face, the one who had first spoken to the family, sat with his head slightly lowered, his eyes fixed on the fire, his face a mask of quiet exhaustion.